Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 36, being recorded on August 31st, 2022. This is S4A. My assistant, Ben Shapiro, has the day off. So in this stream, we are going to be covering a number of articles that I've clipped and prepared for the show. But the main focus, there'll be a couple of topics, but the main focus is COVID. So this is something the US and most of the other US allied world is desperately trying to forget about, and they desperately want us to try to forget about it as well. However, we're going into the fall. It's the end of August, and pretty soon, as September goes on, particularly get into October, we're not far from the time when people are spending more and more time indoors, windows closed, and there's less fresh air and all like that. And this is, no big surprise. We've witnessed it several years in a row now, where the big COVID spike starts happening. And actually, let's just kick it off with some BioBot as usual. This is from website biobot.io, biobot.io/data. And we have a few different things. So this is wastewater monitoring. It's the most rapid and I would say most reliable way to get a sense of what's going on as far as the amount of COVID that is actually in circulation. So, there are what we call leading indicators and lagging indicators. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll be familiar with these terms. But basically, a leading indicator is one that shows up more quickly. A lagging indicator is one that can show up weeks or months behind a particular phenomenon. So it is an indicator. It is correlated with it, but it's not very timely. So on the other hand, monitoring the wastewater, that happens really as soon as somebody gets infected, the virus starts replicating in the person's body, and then they excrete it into the wastewater, which if it's monitored, scientists can pick up the amount of viral particles, whether it's RNA or whatever it is, in the wastewater. The next indicator is cases, but there are huge problems with relying on case counts right now. For one thing, it is more lagging. It takes a few days for symptoms to show up. Although COVID has consistently been mutating for symptoms to take longer to show up. It used to take on average about 5 days for the initial strain for people to really get the clear symptoms. Now it only takes 3.5 days. And that's as COVID has evolved to be more contagious and more immune evasive as well. But the other big problem is they're not really counting cases anymore. Now there's rapid tests and people rely on those, and they're not necessarily getting PCR tests. So, whatever the official case count is, I would say at least double it to get, all of the cases that are just being discarded as far as rapid tests. But it also, takes about a week longer to get the case count, or at least several days longer. Then hospitalizations, because again, hospitalizations, now you catch COVID one day, end up in the hospital 24 hours later. It takes a while for you to get sick enough for somebody to go, hey, I think you need to go to the hospital, or some complication to arise that requires that kind of medical attention. And then finally, death. COVID usually doesn't kill straight off. It'll be, you get it, so it'll show up in the wastewater. You'll get symptoms, so maybe we'll detect a case, maybe not if it was a rapid test. And then maybe you get hospitalized, and then maybe a few days or a week after hospitalization, you might die. So anyway, leading versus lagging indicators. So the wastewater is a great way of getting a sense. Look at what's been happening. So obviously we had a huge spike. If you look at the January 2022, this was Omicron. It was an enormous spike during the time of year where we normally do get the biggest spike, as you can see back December, January of 2021, that was the winter of 2020 into 2021. There was also a big surge. That was the original strain of COVID, though, which was less contagious, less severe. Then Delta comes in, that's the little mountain in the fall of 2021. Never really goes back to normal, and then it skyrockets into oblivion for Omicron. Then it comes back down and pretty low, but then what happens? Well, this past spring, BA2 started. Another variant in the Omicron family, and BA2 caused that big plateau. So we're looking at the longest sustained surge really outside of Delta and Omicron. We're getting a very long, many months long sustained surge that plateaued for a long time. Then you see that sort of mountain peak. That was BA4 and BA5 coming in. Now that has been receding, as you can see. However, it's now leveling off. We don't have this week's data in yet. Those data usually come in like Thursday or Friday. So it being Wednesday, that's not something we have access to right now. But if we take a closer look, this is the last 6 weeks only. That previous screen was the entire pandemic. What's happening? Well, it's flattening out, and it's flattening out at about 90% or so of the the overall thing. This chart, it's a bit scrunched up. Like you can see, it's sort of artificially flat there at the top. Not sure what's going on with that, but if you look at the other chart, it's about 80 or 90%, and it's leveling out again. So it's plateauing again. So for a while, people were saying, oh, look, BA5 is burning out. Yeah, well, no, it isn't, because now it's leveling out at a fairly high level. If we look at the regions, because they also do a regional breakdown, there's the whole pandemic. So you can see it's pretty sizable overall, but let's get to the close-up of the last 6 weeks on the regional. There we go. So again, they're all kind of flattening out. The Northeast, South, and Southeast, and the Midwest, and like northern, middle of the country, those are, declining, but at a decreasing rate of deceleration. So they're close to flattening out. The West, which is really just everything, really the entire like western half of the United States, basically, is that turquoise color. That has not only completely flattened out, it appears to be ticking up again. So this seems to be maybe the fate is BA5 came in and, caused that little mountain peak. And now it has receded somewhat, but it's not going back to zero. It's flattening out at a pretty good, I'll put the first thing back up on the screen again. It's flattening out pretty close to where we were at in that plateau, in April and May and June. So anyway, that's an overall look at COVID. We will be covering some COVID articles in more detail because, like I said, we're heading into the fall. Summer will be ending in about 3 weeks. And, of course, what that means practically in different, some places will be warmer for longer than others. So people will be outside longer, or you can keep windows open and whatever. But within the next 2 months, by November for sure, people are going to be mostly back indoors, breathing that recycled air. And that's when COVID really goes nuts. And the point here is, if it really goes nuts, we're starting from a pretty bad place in the first place, not unlike how Omicron piggybacked off of Delta last fall into winter. Now, they are saying that they're bringing out a BA5 specific booster shot that has been submitted to the FDA, I believe, like this week. So we'll see what actually happens there. If it were me, I'd probably wait to get that booster shot until, close to the end of October at least, because the booster, it's good to get those to a point. Like, we need to stop transmission. That's why I say to a point. They do cut down on symptoms. They reduce your odds of ending up hospitalized, all of which are good things. COVID is nasty stuff, and we're going to look at how long COVID is disabling people and causing huge numbers of people to be missing work right now. It's a hugely destabilizing thing. Plus, just on a personal level, the amount of personal suffering it causes is immense. Excuse me, gotta get a drink of water here. Where was I going with that? The booster shot. What we don't know is how effective this is really going to be, and the coverage does wane after a number of months. It's, kind of, you get the best coverage right in the first 2 months. It does start dropping after that until, 6 months out, it'll be substantially less coverage. So personally, if I'll be getting a booster, which I probably will, I want to sort of maximize, it tends to get the worst in November, December, January, and I want the best coverage for that personally. So we'll see, will this be a point where, they finally time the booster with the strain that it's supposed to match and really get it under control? will a new strain just emerge and basically undermine all these efforts? Again, there's like zero effort going into transmission control right now, which is how we keep getting new mutations. As I mentioned many times, cells or viruses, which are not really the same as regular cells, when genetic matter, let's say, replicates, there's always chance mutations that occur, some of which confer advantage to the genetic material in relation to the particular environment that it's in. In the case of COVID, the more it replicates, the more it's rolling those dice of coming up with the mutation that's going to enable it to dodge antibodies or whatever it is. So you don't want that. And if these boosters aren't as effective as they hope, we're in for a hell of a winter. I mean, really. So, all right, let's go back to the normal screen for a minute. Actually, let's thank the patrons first. Thanks to the patrons whose names are on the screen. This support, we don't run ads on the channel or do sponsorships or anything like that. I don't believe that really has a place in communist media. But the financial support is great. I do have bills to pay. And it's been great to see. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers on the channel. And of course, there are more viewers than that who just aren't subscribed. Although do like, share, subscribe, and comment, because all of that helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people. And that's what we want to do. We want to put it in the hands of more and more viewers out there who are out there wondering about society, wondering about economic conditions. And we want to pull them into this conversation. Getting YouTube to make that recommendation is actually really helpful. Of course, you can also share it on social media, and that helps in a more direct way as well. But the patrons have really allowed me to spend a lot more time on this than I would have been able to do otherwise. It is, of course, everyone's revolutionary duty as class-conscious workers to contribute whatever they can to revolutionary efforts. It does help when you have the support, though, and you can devote, significant amounts of time to it, again, when you have bills to pay, as capitalism imposes on all of us. All right. So let's check in with the chat before we go into our first, possibly, I think, only non-COVID related article for the day. There was discussion in the chat of the fertilizer shortage. I actually haven't heard about that, but according to a commenter checking in from Nebraska, a big fertilizer company announced a big cut to production, and there have been a lot of mysterious explosions at fertilizer plants and places that make other key ingredients. No, I have not heard about that. Somebody, though, asks, isn't there a global shortage of fertilizer? And again, that's something that is a new one on me. I have not heard that specifically. The thing that I have heard, actually, is there's massive flooding in Pakistan right now. I mean, to the point where entire buildings are just getting, washed away. And apparently tens of millions of people are being affected by that. They had big floods back in 2010, but the reports are that these floods are even worse. And there's crazy video of like newly built hotels collapsing and just other multi-story buildings getting washed away into rivers and stuff like that. So, this is, I don't know the specific situation there. I know that they had been having a lot of, extreme heat. One of the problems about heat and drought is that the more the ground kind of dries out and bakes together, the less water that it's able to absorb quickly. In other words, if you have grass and trees and other plants like that, shrubs and, plants at every level, from really simple grasses and what we would call, quote, weeds, plants that kind of, break ground the first, and then on up to, multi-year shrubs and then bigger trees and things. The ground that has all the plant matter in it can, like a sponge, absorb water a lot more easily because the dirt is more broken up. There's also going to be more fungal mycelium. And of course, the plants can soak up some of the water as well. So when you get heavy rain on a densely vegetated area, then that vegetation assists with the uptake of the water. If, though, you have just like baked hard ground that's not broken up by roots or anything like that, and you dump water on it, it just kind of runs across the surface. So this is a problem where, if you have a drought, even if you get a lot of rain later, it can cause flooding because it doesn't get absorbed into the earth. It just stays on top and then runs off and then damages stuff because Water, of course, is pretty heavy. Gallon of water weighs over 8 pounds, and it really adds up. You can get a lot of momentum going with a big, flood of water. So apparently, also they have had they normally have like 3 or 4 monsoon cycles per year, but I think this year they've had 8. So anyway, bad stuff going on in Pakistan. Somebody else was mentioning the water crisis in Mississippi. Can't believe they're just going to go without water indefinitely. What the hell? Yeah, so I saw this in passing in a news story just yesterday, where there are storm damaged places in Mississippi where they're just like, oh yeah, the public water is going to be off for a while because the main got damaged. Oh well, and there's not really a plan. And people were citing examples of Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey, and other places that have had the undrinkable water crisis where it's poisoned with lead or whatever. Here, it seems like in the US, things like housing and potable water are just being treated like, luxuries, like non-essentials. And, you know, people can say what they want about Bernie Sanders. I'm not short on criticisms of Bernie Sanders, but I do remember one of the ads that the Sanders campaign ran was like talking to people out in really impoverished areas in the South that were dealing with the wastewater ponds or whatever the hell they call them that are connected with the CAFOs, the big factory farm animal agriculture places. And there's just these gigantic pools of like animal waste, just like open air septic tanks. And people are dealing with that. And, a lot of the conditions are just awful, like shocking to people who have grown up in more developed parts of the United States. You can't believe it looking at it. And like I said, say what you want about Bernie Sanders. That was one of the last times that there was any kind of big money. I mean, it wasn't corporation money, it was individual donors. But, that there was some organized campaign putting out media, like shining a light on stuff like that. That's why I say we need the Bernie Sanders moment again, but outside the Democratic Party. Because obviously inside the Democratic Party is controlled by capital completely, and it will crush the movement. We need to do it again, but outside. And there were some really beautiful moments in that campaign. That being, I think, one of them was like, when else are people ever listened to or like put into any kind of a spotlight like that? I mean, whether it's for a political campaign or not, you can say, "Oh, Bernie was just trying to get the votes." First of all, I mean, it's Bernie Sanders. It's not the same as like Pete Buttigieg as far as the campaign goes. But you think Hillary Clinton's going to put something like that in a campaign ad? Probably not. So yeah. What else do we have? Another comment here. I was perusing Twitter and I stumbled upon accounts of Marxists who are anti-vax, anti-lockdown, anti-mask because they believe it is coordinated class warfare by the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Seems pretty crazy to me. They're obviously devout Marxists, so it makes me think. Well, I don't know who you're talking about, so I can't speak to whether they are, quote, obviously devout Marxists or not. I will say there's a ton of right-wingers. Well, first of all, socialism fell into revisionism and just basically confusion several decades ago. So there's a lot of crap floating around, even on the inside of the movement. We need to fix that. But also, there's a ton of right-wingers trying to co-opt the names of Marxism, socialism, communism right now. And these sort of reactionary, contrarian, populist things. This has been a fight that we've had for a while, and the stance of this channel is very clear. For example, we oppose the Blue Trucks Clan, the Canadian Freedom Convoy, which is run by some neo-Nazis are involved directly in the organization of that protest. This is not pro-worker stuff at all, and we had that conversation back in the winter. But yeah, as far as being anti-vax, that's just a standard issue, old-timey fascist position. That's the way that's always been. Marxists are for science, and generally speaking, unless there is some massive downside to the vaccines, which in this case, these vaccines are fundamentally no different than any others in terms of the outcome. I frequently will argue with people on Twitter, for example, about how, these mRNA vaccines, which are unique. That is a new technology. It's been in development for 20 years, but this is the first one that has been actually used out in public. That's not to say it's brand new. Like I said, it's been in development for 20 years, the technology has. But somebody was trying to make out the mRNA COVID vaccines. I'll go, oh, why can't we have the attenuated virus vaccines that other countries have? And I looked up the stats comparing the Sinopharm vaccine, that's the Chinese one, to the Moderna one. And they're comparable. They're completely comparable in terms of the myocarditis or whatever you want to mention. I was looking at the myocarditis specifically. And for both of them, it's about 6 or 7 cases per 100,000. That's medicine. I'm sorry. Any kind of medicine is going to cause some adverse reactions. That's just the way it is. And the point here is that the risk of the disease far outweighs the risk of the medicine, making it a good medicine. So it's also preventative. In other words, you can't just wait for people to get COVID and then try to give them monoclonal antibodies or whatever else after the fact. That's not enough. Now, again, the problem that I have with the position that capital overwhelmingly has taken pretty much the world over is they're doing nothing about control and trying to do a vaccine or transmission control, stopping the spread. And they're trying to do a vaccine-only policy, not even mandating masks anymore. That's insane. And unfortunately, somebody recently I was talking to from the Greek Communist Party, KKE, we call it in English, they're a pretty good party, honestly, I think, from everything I've seen. Unfortunately, they echo this policy of COVID, at least per what that member of theirs or former member was telling me, is, the vaccine-only thing is good enough. It clearly isn't. It clearly isn't. So the anti-lockdown stuff, a lot of that was petty bourgeois stuff about, oh, my hair salon is going to close, or, oh, my little restaurant's going to close, or whatever. And that's it is what it is. A lot of those people I would not really consider class allies because they have declared themselves to be ardent class enemies. The U.S. petty bourgeoisie, with some exceptions of like people who may be petty bourgeois now, but spent most of their life in the proletariat and may still have more, have that history of proletarian consciousness or whatever. They may be a bit more aligned or less hostile to the proletariat. A lot of these people, though, really see us as garbage, and they're willing to sacrifice our lives for their, hair salon or whatever. So, I mean, I take that under advisement as far as judging that. But yeah, there has been this petty bourgeois line out there that is, oh, well, the big capitalists like Amazon or whatever, they just want the lockdown so that the smaller businesses can go out of business, and then they have they have no competition. Ha, smug look. Well, that's what capitalism does anyway. I mean, whether it's from a lockdown or whether it's just from the regular non-accelerated course of historical development, that's what's going to happen anyway. Eventually, like, Amazon's going to, open up some subsidiary that like moves into your territory. And that's just the way that it goes. Capital tends to consolidate over time, buy out competitors, just outcompete competitors. They can do things that, offer lower prices and stuff like that. So as far as that whole like, oh, well, the lockdowns, it's just a scam of the capitalists. They want to put the smaller business out of business. They were going to do that anyway. So, just so you know. But beside that, that's sort of overlooking the fact that there is a dangerous, highly contagious virus spreading that is, by some counts, more contagious than measles, and possibly the most contagious virus known to mankind. So, that's a problem. But a lot of these people will flat out deny that the virus even exists. You still get some of those people. And then anti-mask. Tell me how anti-mask, or tell me how, like, mask mandates, that's coordinated class warfare by the bourgeoisie. The only thing it truly affects is restaurants, because you got to take the mask off to eat, or it's something similar to that. And of course, we went through in 2020, like people boycotting restaurants for like 2 weeks, and it seemed like it was going to implode the entire economy. That's that kind of house of cards that capitalism is built on. But yeah, as far as anti-mask otherwise, that's not really like, I think that this is kind of after the fact justification of just stuff that they don't feel like doing. And it's a lot of just, trying to line the facts up to what they want to believe. There's a dangerous virus, on the other hand, that's a fact. It's highly contagious, it's airborne. Masks like N95s or P100s or KN95s, if they're not counterfeit. In the US, selling KN95s, that's not a US standard, so selling counterfeit KN95s, there seems to be more of that than counterfeit N95s. They may not be actually as effective. But yeah, like wearing a high quality mask that's rated to filter out a high level of particulate matter, that's gonna stop the spread. Like that's not a fucking conspiracy, dude. So yeah, this needs to be rejected and denounced anywhere that it's encountered. If you're interested in that, message me, because I'm always looking for other people to sort of coordinate with on COVID stuff, as far as Twitter or something like that. Anyway, yeah, as another commenter said, they think COVID is either fake or mild, and most of the deaths are essentially the ruling class murdering us. It's out there. So yeah, I mean, the sort of denialism and minimization, these are huge problems. And it needs to be, well, we'll be pushing back on it in this stream when we get into the long COVID stuff. As I've said in all of my COVID updates, you have to separate out the acute phase of COVID from long COVID. The acute phase is the first 3 or 4 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks, which is where like the biggest risk of death and stuff like that happens. Okay, so the thing is, the vaccines dramatically reduce your odds of landing in the hospital or dying. That's great. Also Paxlovid, especially in conjunction, that's the antiviral pill. That in conjunction with the vaccine, again, dramatically reduces your odds of hospitalization or death, but particularly in the old people, and we're going to read an article about that. And when I say old people, I mean really the oldest demographic, like 60 to 90 or whatever. However long people are living these days. For younger people, it may not really be so effective. The vaccine is, though. So yeah, they're like, well, people don't die during the acute phase anymore. Case closed. No, not case closed. Because even among the vaccinated, per a study that we covered recently, 1 in 6, even of vaccinated people, get long COVID. And that's causing noticeable disruptions. And it's also going to cause a whole cascade of medical system overwhelm in the coming years, because people are now walking around with weaker hearts, weaker kidneys, weaker lungs, weaker nervous systems, on and on. And so that might not catch up with you right away, but it might cause you to die 5 years earlier. It might cause you to have a heart attack 3 years earlier than you were going to, et cetera, et cetera. It's just contributing to the frailty that normally happens during aging. We can try to keep our bodies in good condition through exercise, rest, good diet, maybe supplements if you research that kind of thing well, or a provider recommends it to you. But bottom line is we do all eventually age, though we can try to age in better shape with less suffering and better quality of life. But, the virus causes massive inflammation throughout your body. It weakens major organ systems. And that's the kind of aging you just don't want. It's literally what people are like, oh, I don't fear COVID. I exercise and I'm this Joe Rogan manly man. Well, all that shit you're trying to do, you're taking the MCT, like coconut oil, and you're doing all the like whatever fucking other things that you're doing, some of which have some value. Like, don't get me wrong. Eating healthy and all that matters. Like, eat a lot of vegetables, eat a lot of fruits, high fiber, stay away from excessive alcohol and animal products and shit like that. No, all that does, like, that can be good for you. It can prolong your life and reduce your likelihood of developing some kind of chronic disease, for sure, heart disease or whatever. But it's like these same people that are these sort of health supremacists in a negative sense. Obviously, it's better to be healthy than unhealthy, but health supremacists in that sense, where it's just like, oh, I'm this ubermensch, and I don't live my life in fear because of I take such great care of myself. Well, catching COVID, let me see if I have the screenshot because I feel like it speaks for itself and it's just kind of a striking image. Where is it now? Here we go. Even, we've covered this in a previous video, even mild COVID-19 can cause your brain to shrink. Recent brain imaging shows that the disease can cause physical changes equivalent to a decade of aging. So for all the people who are, I like to exercise, trying to do all that stuff so that as an either or, oh, I never take any medicine at all, oh, I don't fear the virus or whatever. You catch COVID once, you're causing physical changes potentially equivalent to a decade of aging and triggering problems with attention and memory. Also, it has been shown to reduce in many people overall brain volume. It especially affects parts of the brain associated with memory. So you can do all this, like, get lots of antioxidants and all that stuff's great. Have smoothies, put dark berries in them and, leafy greens, like get all that stuff. Okay, it's good for you. But then you say, oh, well, I'm not afraid of the virus. Well, literally, what are you doing all this healthy stuff for if you're just going to like piss it away by catching a virus that's going to cause systemic inflammation and like age you a decade? Do you see how that doesn't make sense? That's contradictory. So that's the point I would like to make to those people. And you can't just wish this away either. Like the amount of studies on this, if you care to look, are staggering. And like I said, we'll be looking through some of that information. So there's a comment on the fertilizer thing. The global fertilizer shortages are because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Essentially, Russia is one of the world's largest exporters, and with sanctions, the world won't get any. Prolacult talks about this in one of the recent videos, the fertilizer shortage. Okay, yeah, they did a big video about the coming like food shortages. I guess I missed that particular part about fertilizer. I was just in shock from some of the other information. I do recommend that video. So thank you for that piece of information. Let's see what else. Capitalism is good, somebody pops in to add. Yeah, it's good if you like a really unstable economic system and being thrown out of work constantly. Tremendous contribution to the chat. Thank you. I saw that disgusting footage of the pollution off the pig farms, basically saying how sick they would literally get pig shit in the air. I saw that they spray it in the air and it spreads to impoverished communities. Yeah, and that in that case was a good example of environmental racism because it was specifically people of color who were, getting like those are the communities that those things were being stuck into. Beautiful moments during the Sanders campaign, workers telling stories from their own mouths about trying to get health care. Remember the bird moment on the campaign trail? I know we were materialists, but it felt magical. Yeah, there's always those sort of, odds-defying little moments that keep life interesting for sure. That was a very nice moment. But yeah, I mean, and it's stuff you wouldn't see out of most people. Now we need to keep that going, like amplifying workers' voices, making a real working class movement like that. But unlike Bernie, don't feed into the fucking Democrats. So anyway, here we had a comment, troll comment. Lol, socialists using capitalism to spread their message about socialism. What a joke. I don't know if you know this, but literally the entire theory of historical materialism, fundamental to Marxism, is that capitalism creates socialism. That capitalism, the more that it spreads, capitalism overthrows feudalism and then creates the proletariat, a class of propertyless workers who only have our labor to sell and have no interest in private property. We don't own any and never will own any. We'll never be able to live off of capital. And we have no interest in perpetuating the system. So as far as lol, socialists using capitalism to spread the message, yeah, that's always how it has worked. Proletarians become class conscious in capitalism because that's where we are created, is in capitalism. And then we seek to abolish capitalism. It's like saying, haha, slaves rebelling against slavery. Well, yeah. Like they were enslaved by the slave masters, and they are going to abolish that system. Don't know what to tell you. Don't know what to tell you. Don't know really. That's just really like you wrote that out. It didn't occur to you while you were writing it out what I was going to say to that. Well, hopefully this was helpful. All right. Somebody says, I read a really good article about the links between fascism and COVID denial and stuff. It's all about seeing health as an innate quality of a person that marks them as superior. Pretty disturbing stuff. That's what I mean by the health supremacists, where they're like, oh, I am this ubermensch, like my genes, whatever, they're so great. There's also a lot of sense of I deserve it and things like that. I mean, this is just tied into ableism generally. It fits under the category of ableism generally. Now, everybody wants health. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think given the choice to have a short, painful life versus like a longer, pain-free life, probably most of us would take the longer, pain-free life, where you have, you know, more of an opportunity to actually try to experience the beauty of the world and not get overwhelmed by the pain of the world, and to realize various things that you would like to realize as a human being. So, you know, otherwise, why live? But yeah, these people take it to another level in terms of the ideology of it. And unfortunately, you know, with COVID for them, it's definitely anti-scientific prejudice thinking that is going to cause them severe damage. Vaccines don't stop you from getting COVID. They reduce the symptoms. They, you still contract the disease. That's why I said we need a separate strategy for stopping transmission, such as masks and targeted shutdowns as needed. Also, policies like test to stay in schools, which they have totally scrapped basically everywhere. Quarantining appropriately. Actually, that's our first story. So why don't, there's more from the chat, which I will catch up with. Let's go into the first story, because this had to do with how Biden was out for like, it took him 2 weeks to test negative completely. That's, how many people did he spread it to? So here's a story about Jill Biden. Jill Biden tests, this is from August 29, so Monday. Jill Biden tests negative for COVID-19 and will return to Washington on Tuesday. First Lady Jill Biden has tested negative for COVID-19 after a rebound case. What's a rebound case? Rebound case is Paxlovid rebound. So you get COVID, you test positive. You take the Paxlovid pill, which is an antiviral pill, and it has a 5-day course. You take it for 5 days. And then after the 5 days, you test positive again. In other words, during the course of it, it reduces the amount of virus to where you test negative, but then it bounces back after you stop taking the drug. From there, your body usually can fight it off, although maybe not in every case. Anyway, she got a rebound case. So she tested positive, took the pill, tested negative, stopped the pill, because you only take it for 5 days. It's a pretty rough drug as far as like toxicity on your body. Not to say that dying of COVID is better, but just stating a fact, it's not exactly a non-toxic substance. Anyway, you know, I mean, compared to other medicines is the point. So anyway, she took it for the 5 days, then tested positive again. That's a rebound case. Continuing, and will return to the Washington, D.C. area on Tuesday, Communications Director Elizabeth Alexander said in a statement Monday. Biden had tested positive. Sorry, every time I read Biden, I think Joe Biden. I guess they mean her. Jill Biden had tested positive for a rebound case last week after first testing positive on August 15 while vacationing in Kiowa Island, South Carolina. The First Lady had, quote, cold-like symptoms the first time around, according to Alexander, and was put on a cycle of the antiviral drug Paxlovid, which can trigger a rebound case of COVID-19 in some people, many people, well, I think it's around 10%, several days after a negative test result. President Joe Biden tested negative last week after being considered a close contact to the First Lady, a White House official told CNN. The president had also taken Paxlovid when he had COVID-19 last month and he eventually tested positive for a rebound case following negative tests. While isolating in South Carolina during her first diagnosis, the First Lady worked on her blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, yeah, there's a couple of details. I don't think they're especially important. But she first tested positive on August 15 and then finally tested negative somewhere around the 29th. So this thing took 2 weeks. That's not great for you. Between the Paxlovid itself and having the virus doing its thing in your body for that long, that's not so great. I mean, again, causing massive damage in your body. If it gets to the point where you get hospitalized, that tends to be significantly worse as far as the organ damage that you will sustain, and it bumps your long COVID odds up to about 50 or 60% if you get hospitalized. So, as I've said many times, getting hospitalized with COVID, it's not like you walk out of the hospital fresh and frisky. You come out of the hospital clinging to life. COVID, if it's strong enough that you wound up in the hospital, you are coming out with massive inflammatory systemic damage in your body, most likely. And then your odds of developing a long COVID condition, which can last up to a year, maybe longer, substantially increased if you had an infection severe enough to land you in the hospital. But off of this, let's do a second article. This one's on Paxlovid itself. This was interesting, to say the least. So August 24th, although I've not read all the details yet, let's get into it. So this is from USA Today. Last one was from CNN. Paxlovid, Pfizer's COVID pill, that's what we're talking about, showed no measurable benefit in adults 40 to 65, study says, by Matthew Perrone from the Associated Press. From Washington, Pfizer's COVID-19 pill appears to provide little or no benefit for younger adults, while still reducing the risk of hospitalization and death for high-risk seniors, according to a large study published Wednesday. The results from a 109,000 patient Israeli study. Tell you, Israel, genocidal apartheid state of Israel, has really been kind of a canary in the coal mine of this whole pandemic. For some reason, like a lot of the studies that the anti-vaxxers use are out of Israel about the Pfizer vaccine, which is one of the worst vaccines. From what I've seen, the Moderna is probably the least likely to give you complications or side effects and the most likely to be like very effective. But there's all these studies out of Israel where I think they're mostly using Pfizer, and it's just not that good. Anyway, another study out of Israel about Paxlovid this time, though, completely different subject of the study, which has become the go-to treatment for COVID-19 due to its at-home convenience. Oh, yeah, nutritious and delicious Paxlovid. The Biden administration has spent more than $10 billion purchasing the drug and making it available at thousands of pharmacies through its Test and Treat initiative. The researchers found that Paxlovid reduced hospitalizations among people 65 and older by roughly 75% when given shortly after infection. So you stop the infection at an early stage. You can reduce the hospitalizations if you're 65 and older. You have three out of 4 chances of avoiding the hospital. So that's great. But it's not bulletproof, and people need to remember that. Anyway, that's consistent with earlier results used to authorize the drug in the US and other nations. So that's what the study found. It's consistent with earlier studies. In other words, that confirms earlier research, and, that's reason to believe that that's accurate. But in this study, people between the ages of 40 and 65 saw no measurable benefit, according to the analysis of medical records. The study had limitations due to its design, and I'll just say here, I have not read the study itself, so I can't comment on that firsthand, which compiled data from a large Israeli health system rather than enrolling patients in a randomized study with a control group, which is the gold standard for medical research. Let me just say right there, it is true that RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are the gold standard for medical research. So why, you might ask, would anyone do anything else? Well, it's really difficult sometimes setting up an RCT. So, the bottom line is we cannot get all of our information from RCTs, and that's it. So, citing that it wasn't an RCT is really not enough to just undermine the study completely. All right. The findings reflect the changing nature of the pandemic, in which the vast majority of people already have some protection against the virus due to vaccination or prior infection. Time out. Some of the main mutations that the virus has been doing is to become more immune evasive. Mention this every single time that we've covered this in I think all of 2022. The major mutations in the virus are occurring in the parts of the virus that the antibodies that your body puts out or get infused into if you're getting monoclonal antibodies as a treatment. The antibodies try to essentially, handcuff the virus. But what if the virus has no hands? Handcuff's going to slip right off the wrist. Well, that's the kind of mutation that the virus is showing. It's harder. It's for the immune system to catch it, basically. It's making it slipperier. The parts of the virus that the antibodies dock with are mutating themselves to change their structure so that they can't be caught so easily. So people are getting reinfected a month or two after infection. So despite this, quote, natural immunity, this is the herd immunity shit that was debunked in 2020. We've now got mainstream news outlets parroting this stuff. Whereas if you said that back in 2020 or 2021, you would rightly be shut down for saying it by major sources, such as the, quote, party of science, the Democratic Party. Now they're jumping on the herd immunity bandwagon. That's exactly what they're doing. Now they'll say, oh, well, we have the vaccine as well. Okay, so call it herd immunity plus. But the bottom line is, even with the vaccines, even with your natural antibodies from a wild infection, you're going to get reinfected. And we covered this before. There was a Forbes article, great science writer writing a lot about COVID at Forbes, William Hazeltine. And he wrote about the risks of reinfection with BA5. And every time you get reinfected, all of the major health risks associated with COVID, such as clotting disorders and other things, they go up steadily every time you get reinfected. So, do you get some temporary immunity from getting a COVID infection? Yes, of course. But it is A, temporary, and B, it comes at a pretty steep price, which is particularly compared to the vaccine. The vaccine, there is a slight risk of side effects, and you might feel crappy for a day, but it's not doing the kind of systemic damage to your body in most cases that the virus definitely has a much higher chance of doing. Anyway, natural immunity, A, temporary, B, comes at a staggering cost of systemic inflammation, aging all of your major organs. Not really a great trade-off. What would be better? Not getting infected. That's not what they're running with anymore. So, it's now on us. They can't, capitalism has hit its limit of dealing with this pandemic. We have to take up the slack and use this as a point of agitation against capitalism. Nobody really wants to get sick and die 5 or 10 years early, but that's exactly, and then live out the rest of your life, however long it is, in an increased state of pain. Nobody wants that. Those are things most people, given the choice, try to avoid, all things being equal. So anyway, this is what capitalism is giving you now, a shorter, more painful life. Is that what you want? It's not what I want. So anyway, where were we? Yeah, so some protection against the virus. Don't play that up. It's temporary and it comes at a huge cost. Huge cost if it's a natural infection. Vaccine is better, but again, it is limited coverage. For younger adults in particular, that greatly reduces their risks of severe COVID-19 complications. No, it does not. During the acute phase, like I said before, you have to separate out the acute phase from long COVID. So is it true that, the vaccine will reduce your odds of long COVID? Okay, yes. And could you even say that it greatly reduces them? Well, if it reduces them from 35% to 15%, you could say that that's a great reduction. However, 15% is noticeable. I think it was 17% if you had both shots, and then 16% if you got boosted. So the boost gave you a minimal additional protection against long COVID, according to a study that we covered earlier in a previous COVID update. So, if that's where the risk is bottoming out, around 1 in 6, that's not great. If it was 1 in 100, it would still be risky, but that would be you know, that would be where you could start calling it more negligible, I guess, but it still wouldn't be negligible, still really wouldn't be the right word. But it's 1 in 6 for fuck's sake. I mean, really. Anyway, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which will be changing their name to the Centers for Disease, because that's where they're at, recently estimated that 95% of Americans 16 and older have acquired some level of immunity against the virus. Yeah, well, that's not fucking good enough. You know, just not dying during the acute phase is not good enough. We know from a population study out of Estonia we covered previously that people were, even if they didn't die in the acute phase, more likely to die in the next 12 months after their infection. So it's doing huge damage to your body. It's shaving time off of your life. We just don't know how much. And do you want to roll the dice, or should we start taking other approaches, like re-implementing stuff that we did in the past? And there are many things short of just blanket shutdowns. You know, don't let people portray it as that, because there's a lot you can do short of that. And but people don't want to have that conversation at all. Well, we have to force it. Anyway, continuing. Quote, Paxlovid will remain important for people at the highest risk of severe COVID-19, such as seniors and those with compromised immune systems, said Dr. David Boulware. But for the vast majority of Americans who are now eligible, this really doesn't have a lot of benefit. So that's Paxlovid. If you are old and at the highest risk of severe COVID, okay, Paxlovid may work for you. If you're not, it may not do anything. Spokesman for Pfizer declined to comment on the results, which were published in the New England Journal of Medicine major journal. So there's some more details. You can read them on the screen. I do kind of want to move on. Here's the last screenshot. Pfizer reported earlier this summer that a separate study of Paxlovid in healthy adults, vaccinated and unvaccinated, failed to show a significant benefit. Those results have not yet been published. So again, you know, it's the pill is useful for the oldest demographic and for people at like the highest risk if you're immunocompromised, even at a younger age. Otherwise, when people talk about, oh, well, we have Paxlovid now, you know, if you're under 60, that's not something that is going to personally affect you. I mean, again, you'll get some protection against severe acute disease from the vaccine, not really from Paxlovid. And, you know, this is the emperor has no clothes kind of moment of the vax-only, Paxlovid-only strategy here. We have to control transmission. I have more on COVID, but let's check in with the chat a little bit before it gets too out of control. I think the key is that masks remind people that a pandemic is going on at all. Yeah, that's true. And capitalists clearly have reached their limit of even wanting people to think about that, because it does raise a lot of questions. It's the height of irresponsibility, though, when you're not having people wear masks sheerly because of the psychological effect. That is, I mean, you're literally having people sacrifice their lives and health for just corporate PR. I mean, it across the entire population all at once. Let's see. Yeah, add over 1 million people, U.S. American people, to the death toll of capitalism due to COVID. Yeah, the death count is over 1 million and rising. Is anyone else going to school? Are you out there as a sociologist? I'm taking a sociology class and I'm wondering how much I should reveal my Marxist perspective on things. It's going to depend on what kind of sociology professor you have. But if your sociology program is worth anything, you should be covering at least some Marx. And then when you get the opportunity to write papers and do projects, you can just focus on something from a Marxist perspective. Marxism isn't completely dead in academia. People don't take it maybe as seriously as before. That's not quite the way that I want to say it. It's been shied away from. You can definitely find more materialist Marxist leaning professors. You will also get some more kind of wackadoo, like postmodernist professors as well. But yeah, I think that unless you have an absolutely awful program, they shouldn't be completely barring you from like discussing Marx in a sociology class for sure. Somebody replies, when I was doing college in sociology, I was an open Marxist. So was the professor. He was amazing. Yeah, you'll definitely run across some for sure. On COVID, somebody says, I have a friend who is obsessed with trying to avoid dementia because it runs in her family, but she's in denial about the links being found between COVID and early dementia. Keep sending her the articles, keep saying, look, I know this is a difficult subject. The fact is, some viruses cause cancer, some viruses cause, chronic fatigue. Like, you can get all kinds of long, we talk about long COVID. How about long polio? Long HIV, etc. Viruses can cause effects that last for decades or lifelong. So, got to snap out of the denial. You keep sending her the information, keep talking in a supportive way about it. But, when she's in the denial, just say like, look, what is it? I know that you're not stupid. I know that you're looking at this article the same as I am. This study showed that that this virus is causing damage to memory and that there are links to early onset dementia. What is it? Throw her the lifeline. What is it that you're struggling with here? What is it? I mean, viruses are harmful things. They cause the thing that you're afraid of. What is it? Help her out. Tell her that you're supportive of it, but she's got to work with you on that. Yeah, people also talking about you don't have to quote come out as a Marxist, but you can just give a Marxist materialist take without explicitly citing Marx if you don't feel comfortable with that. Although, in the end, I don't know what opportunities you're looking for that it may cost you, but if you can just frankly discuss communism, you may feel better, you may not. It all depends. I mean, yes, U.S. society is not generally super friendly to Marxists. I hope that we can change that at some point. But yeah, you can always just give a Marxist take without citing Marxism or whatever. I mean, honestly, you'll probably make your life a bit easier by not, at least at first, in a class like that, because then people just start red baiting and whatever. So, but yeah, it depends, China has only had 243,000 cases of COVID. Yeah, I don't know what the source is on that. I know that they have had few cases and very few deaths. I'm not laughing at this. I was laughing at another comment. Life expectancy is dropping in the U.S. and all over the world, I believe. That is true. The disabled community is screaming to warn us about these things. Yeah, I'm very supportive of that. I had an odd comment on a much earlier COVID update. Somebody was yelling at me about you didn't cover this from the like perspective of a disabled person. I was just like, don't really know what you're like. I really had they didn't offer anything beyond that, and I was like, well, but actually, I don't know. I don't know. I'm actively involved in discussions about those topics, and if there's something specific people would like me to cover, I'm definitely open to that. And in fact, I do try to incorporate everything that I can from the perspectives of people whose health is most threatened by these just letting COVID run wild or whatever. Believe me, my priority is not the people who are very certain that they're going to just, get it and be fine. And, who are loudly shrieking in the rest of our faces to go back to work. We cannot choose health unless we recognize it is not a personal choice, and we must collectively organize for our health and the health of our children. Yeah, so good points there about population health and the social determinants of it, the environmental determinants of it. I was saying hypothetically, like, yes, I think we would all choose, like, it's not like there's a strong contingent of people who are like, I choose ill health, I choose sickness. I think most people, all things being equal, would choose health. Your point is really kind of something else, that the all things being equal is not really the case, because we're all confronted with very different unequal opportunities based on our class and racial and ethnic and other statuses. So yeah, absolutely. We need to take the environment back, or get it out of the hands of the nastiest polluters and everything else. Yes, if we're going to be able to shape the direction of development and of all of it, ecology, because development comes out of ecology and impacts ecology. They're closely connected. We're all living in the biosphere, and everything that we produce, comes out of the biosphere and goes back into the biosphere. That's critical. And the point is, yeah, we need mass organized action to actually have control over the systemic structural conditions that impact our health, for sure. There's so much COVID in the air around us that percentages don't matter. You're going to get it unless you lock yourself down or you live and work in the middle of nowhere. Well, I don't like this thinking at all. I got to be honest. So most places, well, it depends. If you have the option of masking, and you do mask regularly, and you also stay on top of other things, not rubbing your face and whatever, not having other people like breathing directly on you. If you can avoid that, that is going to dramatically cut down your chances. There are plenty of types of work where masking is not something that can at least readily be done. I would fight for it if you can. It depends on the circumstances. But this whole idea everyone's going to get COVID, that's not helpful. It's not helpful, like, leading with that. So I don't know. As far as I know, I haven't gotten COVID since, well, for a year and a half. So, I've been dramatically more careful since I got it because it was devastating. And I do avoid a lot of things, but, and I am able to mask. So it depends, I guess. But anyway, I don't understand the point of this comment. You're going to get it. Well, and like, where are you going with this? So as far as the person, well, she says, I don't want to talk about that when I ask her those questions about being denial about COVID. Just tell her, okay, well, facts don't care about your feelings, as my assistant is fond of saying. And just, the virus really doesn't care whether you want to talk about the virus or not. It just wants to replicate, and it will use your body to do that. So, the ostrich approach just is not going to be helpful. But, you do what you can. Ultimately, it is her choice in the end. So, yeah. You had to change parts of your thesis due to it being too radical. Can you expand on that? I'd be curious what your thesis was. Who made you change it and why? What did they tell you? All right, so this is the same person who is posting a little too much, to be honest. I'm skipping a lot of the comments because I don't especially agree with all of them. But the same person who was just right. Let me double check this, but I believe, yeah, I believe it was the same person. Okay, so you were just telling me about your friend who is terrified of early onset dementia. And you were just describing, I was just reading aloud, how much she is in denial or whatever. The same person wrote, actually, people are not choosing health. They're choosing concerts and capitalism. So you were just talking about the denial. You know, that's a complicated factor. What I'm saying is, all other things being equal, if it were presented as a simple choice with all other things being equal, like somebody like in the Matrix in a completely blank white space with nothing in it, there is a table with somebody sitting behind it, and there are two objects on the table, and one is labeled health, one is labeled sickness. Everything else about your life is going to be exactly the same, but you can choose health or sickness in a complete void. What I'm saying is, I think the overwhelming majority of people would choose health, if not every single one of them. That was my point. But you're saying actually people are not choosing health. Yeah, it's because of all the other factors tangled up in it. Also, the messaging that people are getting, such as COVID is over and everything else. So, again, please listen. It's very frustrating trying to say things and qualify them thoroughly and have people just discard the qualifications. That was super clear in my mind, at least when I first said it. So, yeah. I'm reading someone who calls themselves a neo-Marxist. Not sure what that means, to be honest. Anyone got any idea? Well, who is it? I don't know what that means. Why would you be a neo-Marxist? What is there new to add currently? That would be my question. The whole point is capitalism has not fundamentally changed in all this time. Um, I mean, capitalism is still capitalism, as I am fond of saying. That's why we can read things from Marx or Lenin or Engels, you know, from 100, 150 years ago, and it's still relevant, at least in some of the broad strokes, it's still relevant because capitalism is still capitalism. So, yeah, anyway, I'd be curious as to who that was and what they think the neo part is. Anyway, let's go into, there are two articles that I have on long COVID. I'd like to get through those. I actually have another article I'm just going to put up here in case oh, that wasn't it. It's as part of it, but that wasn't the title screen. There's another article I don't think I'm going to be able to get to. This is a Gallup poll, U.S. approval of labor unions at highest point since 1965 by Justin McCarthy, which is great because it was around 1960 that the U.S. labor movement started taking a nosedive. Around that time, and this was the AFL and CIO merged, or really the AFL, which was always the most conservative labor union or labor federation, excuse me, swallowed up CIO. They didn't really merge like on equal footing. CIO got decimated by the late 40s Red Scare McCarthyism, and all the radicals got kicked out of CIO. CIO was like decimated, and they got swallowed up by AFL, became AFL-CIO, or AFL-CIA, as some people call it today. That was 1955, and then the labor movement peaked like a couple of years after that, and it's been in decline ever since. Clearly, this was not, you know, that did not set up the labor movement for success, to put it mildly. So yeah, private sector unionization peaked at around 30% and then has been in decline, and now it's around 7%. But the good news is people are more approving of labor unions than at any point since that time. So that's great news. It's been many decades, and of course, we're now also neoliberalism wasn't really going yet in 1965. That was just some of the beginning, you know, early stage infection, just the beginning of the rot that neoliberalism eventually would capitalize on. But that's good news. This is a multi-part thing, so I'm not going to be able to get into it. Possibly, I'll come back to it if I can. Otherwise, we'll have to do it in a later stream. But I did want to throw that out there as one piece of positive news. But let's talk about long COVID. So this is an article from CNBC. Long COVID is responsible for about a third of unfilled jobs in the US, new research suggests. So this is what capitalism is taking upon itself to do. All this denialism and minimization, and the CDC just like telling people, oh yeah, who needs to quarantine anyway? It's a bunch of made up shit. This is where it's getting capitalism. So it thinks that the short term, PR, as we were discussing, of like, hey, don't wear masks, everything's great, let's see that smile, people. Well, these are the more medium term effects. Which is going to outweigh which? That's the question. In capitalism, it's always about, quarterly profits, uber alles. That no matter what ideology, like capitalists can try to say, we're environmentalists, we're going to do this for the environment. Well, no, you're only going to do that for the environment if it lines up with the, profits. That's ultimately what constrains all of capitalist thinking is, oh, we're going to be, kind to animals. Well, no, not if you can't keep your profits going up and up and up. There's a decent kind of parody. It's not one-to-one, but I'm reminded of the Simpsons episode where Lisa gets into like recycling, and at the same time Monty Burns is looking for, he's like, my life is empty, I should, oh no, you know what, he loses the company, and then he's like looking for something, unless I'm mixing up my episodes, anyway, it's been a while. Burns decides to do something philanthropic is the point, whatever, it's not important, and he comes across Lisa talking about the environment, whatever, and he's like, oh, I'll do this, environmentalism thing. This sounds great. And then the sort of reveal at the end is the way that he's gone about it is like cravenly profit driven, and they're making like slurry out of all the fish they get caught. Anyway, that's kind of a decent like popular illustration of this. Capitalism does not do things unless it's profitable. It'll, of course, try to put whatever human face or environmental face on it. They might even mean it, but in the end, it really is all about the profits. So anyway, in the case of COVID, this may have bad consequences for their system, although, of course, it's going to come out of our asses first. Let's move on to the next screen. America's ongoing labor shortage raises an important question. Where have all the workers gone? There are 10.7 million unfilled jobs in the U.S., according to the latest data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Some economists point to the high number of workers quitting amid the Great Resignation. New research highlights another troubling factor that may bear part of the blame: long COVID. First of all, I hope that these things are not considered as being mutually exclusive. Did it occur to anyone that people quitting may have some overlap here? Very interesting. We'll see if they are able to, fire up the brain power to make that connection. A Brookings Institution report published Wednesday says that an estimated 16 million Americans between ages 18 to 65, typical workforce age, are experiencing COVID symptoms long after infection. The condition, dubbed long COVID, can include brain fog, fatigue, breathing problems, muscle pain, headache, chest pain, and even anxiety or depression. All symptoms that can make it challenging for people to work. I'm going to add in here, they say brain fog. What does that mean? It means brain damage. It means memory problems. It means cognitive difficulties. It means cognitive impairment. Seen other studies we can't cover today, but which basically show that COVID can indeed induce emotional problems such as anxiety and depression. The anxiety and depression, they found studying people who've had these symptoms, or they contracted the symptoms, developed the symptoms, like 2 years ago. The emotional problems tended to resolve themselves within a year, but the cognitive problems did not. And if you've got, well, first of all, we know about like nerve and brain damage does not tend to regenerate itself. Many other types of tissue can regenerate. Nerve tissue takes extraordinary conditions for it to regenerate in that way, at least in humans. So, if you're still having cognitive problems 2 years afterwards, that suggests that it's probably permanent. Too soon to tell for sure, but that's significant. Anyway, continuing. The report, oh, and as far as making it challenging to work, yes. I had long COVID myself, as I mentioned, from December 2020 on for quite a while. Better part of a year, I'd say 11 months, where it was really noticeable. And I couldn't hold a thought in my head for like more than a few seconds. It was like just the thought would be yanked out of my brain. I was like, well, I don't know what I was thinking about. And this was like a regular thing in a significantly increased way over before. And it tied in with the onset of other symptoms. Anyway, yes, making it challenging for people to work, absolutely. In my case, it absolutely did. The report estimates that 2 million to 4 million of these people are currently out of work due to long COVID. That's almost as high as the number of US Americans who quit their jobs each month amid the Great Resignation. Again, they're still not making the connection here. About 4.2 million quit their jobs in June, and nearly 4.3 million quit in May and April, respectively, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In other words, the jobs lost to long COVID could make up about a third of the country's current labor shortage, and the Brookings report says it's costing the U.S. economy in a significant way. Now, we're not going to break out the violins for the U.S. economy per se, but it is a sign of more instability, which for the people living in the system is not great news. I mean, your average working person, not great news. But let me add here, we are in a situation where capitalism, I mean, we're post-2008 now, global financial meltdown. Everybody at some level is wondering when the next one is going to be. And we are seeing the signs of a union fight back and an overall red fight back. We were talking about that organization before we started recording, I think. But yeah, there is an increased amount of class struggle going on. So people are also, I think, becoming more and more conscious of, well, conditions are shit. I can't pay for my shit anyway. Why am I keeping this job? And, you know, so I think that there may be a factor of conscious class struggle playing into this as well, with the, quote, inflation that's going on. And I say, quote, inflation because I don't think it's just as simple as, yes, the prices have gone up. That's inflation. But I think that this speaks to some underlying instabilities of the system of like, why now? Why is this happening? You know, with all the prices going up, it's like, I think a lot of people are hitting a point of like, I can't pay for my shit anyway. So moving on to the next page. Billions of lost earnings due to long COVID. Based on the average US wage of $1,106 per week, the report estimates that 3 million people out of work due to the condition translates to $168 billion a year in lost earnings. If 4 million long COVID patients are out of work, the lost earnings could be as high as $230 billion, the report says. That's nearly 1% of the country's current dollar gross domestic product of 24.88 trillion. Those high numbers might not even account for the, quote, full economic burden of long COVID. Well, we're also just getting started with long COVID because you look at the amount of cases. Long COVID is basically a proportion of overall cases. Look at how many cases there have been. You know, we're in August, so that's month 8 of the year, about to enter month 9. How many people got COVID back in December and January and February, or during the BA2 and BA4, BA5 plateau? We're just getting warmed up here. We're just getting warmed up. Anyway, that's because they don't account for lower productivity among the many long COVID patients who are working while sick, or the healthcare costs and lost productivity of their caretakers. So yeah, it's gumming things up. Even if people don't completely leave a job, they may not be as productive in job. Again, also, I think more people are, well, you see these articles about, quote, quiet quitting, which is an absurd thing. Quiet quitting is where you just do the bare minimum to not get fired. That's called, in other words, doing your fucking job. Like, the sort of implicit expectation is that you're going to be going above and beyond. No, no. But, you know, they've come up with this term, quiet quitting. So there's a lot of this capitalist worry about what's going on. People don't want the jobs, or they're just doing the bare minimum. Yeah, people are sick of the shit, and COVID is one facet of that. And yes, long COVID is probably inducing some people who otherwise wouldn't ideologically be dragging their feet, wouldn't ideologically be slacking. It wouldn't be coming from a position of conscious, class struggle or resistance to capital. So it's probably not all ideological, but I think that this is also a factor. Will they consider that? It's like, I'm waiting for the paragraph with the big bold line that it's like, maybe workers are just sick of the bullshit? Question mark. Anyway, as long as COVID circulates in the US, the number of people with long COVID symptoms will continue to grow. That's what I was saying. About 1 in 4 COVID patients experience long-term symptoms weeks or months after getting infected, according to multiple studies published last year. But to comment on that again, for unvaccinated people, completely unvaccinated people, believe the average across all age demographics was 40% get long COVID. Partially vaccinated, it'll drop down to 25% or whatever. The CDC is saying 8%. That's massive downplaying, which, by the way, we know how capitalism is going to respond to, I think, every crisis from here on, downplay and cover up. So I think as far as resisting that, independent workers' media and things needs to be pushing back on all the downplaying and the cover-ups. That's going to be a major role. CDC, fucking 8% long COVID. You can at least double that, and that will get you to the rate that fully vaccinated people experience COVID at. But yeah, about 1 in 4, 1 in 5. That's a pretty comfortable estimate, I would say. The Brookings report notes that if the country's long COVID population grows by just 10% each year, the annual cost of lost wages will amount to $500 billion in 10 years. Quote, if long COVID patients don't begin recovering at greater rates, the economic burden will continue to rise, unquote. Remember, this is in a country, the United States, with for-profit healthcare. So it's going to be people needing more heart surgeries, heart pills, all kinds of different, medical interventions. And that's all for profit. And a lot of people just aren't going to get them. And you're going to see more people dying in their 50s and 60s. Like, as a matter of course, routine. Long COVID is more common than you may think. As a medical condition, doctors and scientists are still trying to untangle many puzzles related to long COVID. One thing is clear, anyone can get it. In March 2021, a University of California at Davis health analysis of multiple long COVID studies, a meta-analysis, found that even patients with mild conditions can experience long COVID. Let's finish that. I have a comment. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the most likely patients to develop symptoms are those with initial infections severe enough to require hospitalization, the analysis said. I'll hold my comment. A May study from the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis found that both unvaccinated and vaccinated people are at risk of long COVID. The risk is higher for the unvaccinated, but the study suggested that vaccines only reduced the risk of long COVID by 15%. And yes, I would say to about 15%. The condition can undeniably impact a patient's life, work, and health. Last year, the Americans with Disabilities Act labeled long COVID a disability because of how it can limit the major life activities of patients. We've covered that before. A majority of people who get neurological symptoms of long COVID, it's affecting the nervous system, are unable to return to work. So that's 59%, according to the study, were unable to return to work of people who got long COVID with neurological symptoms. 50% of those who got the neurological symptoms were unable to do regular life daily tasks. So not work, but just basic daily routine tasks. That's how disabling it can be. But the thing that they said before, even patients with mild conditions can experience long COVID. Well, that's the article I put up before with the brain on the picture, is even mild or asymptomatic COVID can cause brain damage and trigger aging equivalent to like a decade's worth of aging. So that's what we're looking at with long COVID. There is exempting people who get hospitalized. Their odds of getting long COVID, as it says here, do go up dramatically. They're at least double everybody else's odds. But if you're not hospitalized, whether you get asymptomatic, mild, or moderate COVID, your odds of long COVID are the same. So you can get a case of COVID that's asymptomatic, you won't even know you have it. And then 2 months later, although to you it's not 2 months later because to you nothing happened, you will come down with long COVID symptoms, which the most common ones are fatigue, quote, brain fog, cognitive impairment, and muscle pain. I believe those are the most common three. So, if there's a surge and then a couple months later, 2 or 3 months later, you develop those symptoms, maybe long COVID. But really now, we looked at the COVID in the wastewater. We've been plateauing for months now. So really in just one long sustained surge. So really it could show up at any time. You could get an asymptomatic case, not know it, and then get long COVID. Then you're scratching your head, what the hell is this? Well, it might be long COVID. So anybody getting these things, look into, is it long COVID? I mean, I've talked to people, you can get seizures from long COVID. There's crazy stuff. All right. A July 2021 study from the Patient-Led Research Collaborative measured the condition's effect on patients' work over the course of 7 months. Only about 27% of long COVID patients worked as many hours as they did before falling ill. Let's read that line again. Only about 27% of long COVID patients worked as many hours as they did before falling ill. So in other words, basically 3 out of 4 long COVID patients had to cut back on their hours, some obviously going down to none. Yeah, that's a disability. Roughly 23% weren't working at all as a direct result of long COVID. That included being on sick leave, disability leave, quitting, being fired, or being unable to find a job that would accommodate them. Ongoing and future research could help determine how to treat the condition, which could get many of those workers back into the workforce. Experts say they're hopeful that they can find answers soon. Quote, I'm cautiously optimistic that given the amount of attention that people are bringing to long COVID, that we're going to get some answers and hopefully some interventions that help people. Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, told CNBC Make It earlier this month. That's the end of the article. People have been talking about long COVID for a while now, and it seems to be an interrelated set of things. Viral persistence is one of them. So you have a low-grade infection that just keeps going on and on. Your body can't completely fight it off, is one of the things. Autoimmunity is another. Dysregulation of your intestinal microbes, so like the different bacteria and things like you get from yogurt and other fermented foods that live in your digestive system. Well, your intestines are a major place that COVID hangs out in, and they can affect those microorganisms negatively. So those are some of the things. We've covered that in previous videos. Ongoing inflammation is a major part of it. So I don't know, maybe there will be a cure for long COVID, maybe there won't be. In the meantime, we need to be stopping transmission. That really needs to be more of the focus, because how many tens of millions of people more are going to get this possibly permanent cognitive impairment before we say, okay, we should stop this now? I read that with polio, it was like 36,000 people a year were getting paralyzed, and that was enough to pull the plug. What's it going to take this time? What's it going to take this time? It's going to take a big fight, and I'm not really even seeing left parties fighting this appropriately. All right, let's go on to the second article about long COVID. This is a long one, and we'll probably close out the video with this. I'll grab the chat for maybe responding to some of this later. This is from the Financial Times, and it just came out yesterday, titled "The Growing Evidence That COVID-19 is Leaving People Sicker." Well, glad you decided to notice. Many of us have been pointing this out for quite a while. The potential impact on heart and brain disease poses challenges to healthcare systems globally. This is by Sarah Neville in London. And for all the problems of the UK, they have at least been talking about long COVID, I would say a lot more than the US has on the whole. Article. When Dr. David Strain encountered a 64-year-old patient on his ward round, the British geriatrician, so a doctor who treats old people or specializes in old people, had a bleak epiphany. Less than 6 months earlier, he had treated the man for COVID-19. Now his deterioration was painful to witness. He came in, quote, he came in with a stroke and really bad delirium, a precursor of dementia, Strain says. I saw the patient, recognized him, and recognized the fact that his brain had dramatically aged. Wow. Almost like we were just talking about that. By unsettling coincidence, the same day Strain, who is based at the University of Exeter in England's West Country, had read a newly published study which identified significant brain shrinkage in a cohort of about 400 people aged between 51 and 81 who had recovered from coronavirus. The encounter crystallized Strain's belief that COVID generated a kind of epidemiological aftershock by leaving people susceptible to a huge range of other conditions, threatening global health systems already struggling with insufficient resources and aging populations. Quote, "It made me realize that this is something we're going to be facing in a really big way in the near future." Let me just add, leaving people susceptible to a huge range of other conditions would not be my preferred phrasing. I think that there's significant evidence COVID is just simply causing a huge range of other conditions. As he started to see a rise in certain conditions in the first year of the pandemic, Strain assumed it was the result of people being unable or unwilling to access healthcare. Only as the pandemic entered its second year did he begin to suspect that COVID itself could be increasing vulnerability to other serious illnesses. Great epidemiological detective work there, buddy. He now sees it as an inversion of the huge drop. Oh, and if I sound not particularly respectful of these various health authorities and MDs and other people who are in a position to do more about this, yeah, it's because I'm not. I think if we were to get justice for all this, there's a whole lot of people who need to have their credentials stripped because of their performance during the pandemic. Anyway. He now sees it as an inversion of the huge drop in respiratory illness doctors saw from the 1980s onwards, when millions either stopped or reduced smoking. The level of damage that's been done to population health during COVID, it would be as if everybody suddenly decided to take up smoking in one go, Strain said. So, in other words, number of respiratory disease, the incidence of them was dropping because people were taking better care of themselves. This is what I was talking about before. It's like, well, you know, I lead a healthy lifestyle. I don't fear the virus. It's like, well, you just literally undid like decades of work you'd put into your body by getting this virus. Anyway, while more data will accumulate in the coming years, there's already evidence to back up his concerns, and many other people's. A Financial Times analysis of data from the UK's NHS, one of the world's richest health data sets, showed significant rises in deaths from heart disease since the start of the pandemic in all but the very oldest age groups. In the 40 to 64 age group, heart attack deaths increased 15% in 2021 compared with 2019. So we read a study on that from, I think it was Mumbai, where heart attacks, I think, increased sixfold. So that's significant. In February, meanwhile, an analysis of more than 150,000 records from the national healthcare databases at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs suggested that even some people who had not been seriously ill with COVID, so the mild to, asymptomatic, mild, and moderate cases of COVID, had an increased risk of cardiovascular problems for at least a year afterwards. So again, get out of your head that the only threat is the acute thing. You're talking about long COVID for a year, and if it did permanent damage, maybe longer. But this is what we're talking about. Acute phase can be asymptomatic, mild, or moderate, and you can still get dramatic increased risk of symptoms that, may cause some kind of a crisis in the next year or so. Researchers found that rates of many conditions, such as heart failure and stroke, were substantially higher in people who had recovered from COVID than in similar people who had not been infected. In other words, the COVID seems to have raised your odds of heart failure and stroke dramatically. And why? Well, it affects the heart directly. It also affects your blood vessels directly. So yeah. A separate analysis of VA data published in March suggested that in the post-acute phase of the disease, thank you for referring to the acute phase if implicitly, people with COVID, quote, exhibit increased risk and burden of diabetes. This is another thing we've seen with children. Getting COVID as a child will increase your odds of getting both type 1 and type 2 diabetes later on. Quote, what's particularly alarming is that these are really lifelong conditions, says Dr. Ziad Al-Ali, Chief of Research and Development at the VA St. Louis Healthcare System and clinical epidemiologist at Washington University in St. Louis, who led both pieces of research. While just 4% more people contracted heart failure following COVID infection than those who had not been infected, quote, because the number of people infected with SARS coronavirus 2 in the world is colossal, even small percentages will translate into huge absolute numbers. So it might be a relatively small percentage, but if, a relatively small percentage of 7 billion is still a huge number. Quote, will it be sufficient to elevate the burden of chronic disease and subsequently put an additional strain on healthcare systems? We think the answer is yes, he said. Some researchers caution that it's, oh yeah, we love caution during an emergency. Love that. Caution that it's too early to draw broad conclusions from limited data. Motherfucker, there is so much data on long COVID, I don't know what to say about this. I mean, this is just willful ignorance. Well, let's see what he says. Dr. Christopher Murray, director of the Seattle-based Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, says that the increases might also reflect inconsistencies in reporting. The first year of the pandemic, for example, many of the deaths in older people had been assigned to dementia when they may in fact have been due to undiagnosed COVID, which had a high death rate in the very elderly. Disentangling that is quite tricky, he said. Well, except in that case, that would actually bump up these numbers. So it's not a cause for caution. That would be cause for more alarm, because that would be a cause for under-reporting COVID damage, right? Anyway. But although the evidence is still coming into focus, it is already becoming clearer to clinicians and health leaders in medical systems around the world that they're coping with a higher burden of disease in the population, whether from the increased susceptibility to serious illness after COVID, or from the lingering, little understood impact of long COVID. I think little understood, they're making this out to be a lot more mysterious than it actually is. We did a sort of long COVID overview study. We did the study itself, not an article on it. That was in the year-end special for 2021. So that was a study out before December 31st, 2021, and I think significantly earlier than that, actually. And what was found in that study was really consistent with there haven't been any major curveballs since then. So this idea that it's little understood, no, what we learned by the end of 2020, or even earlier, by the summer of 2020, about long COVID, it's been fairly consistent actually over time. So that's a downplaying, and it's a mystification. Anyway, at the same time, over the past 2 years, many workers have burnt out or were lost fighting the pandemic on the front lines. Droves of people quit in healthcare. Our capacity may be shrinking at a time when the demand in the population is increasing, warns Eric Schneider, an executive vice president at the National Committee for Quality Assurance, a nonprofit organization that focuses on improving healthcare quality. So the thing I mentioned before, the U.S. overall has like a for-profit healthcare system. What does that mean? It means that for them, quote, overstaffing or, running at low capacity is not profitable, so they don't do it. So when they get, surges of any kind or they have increased demand, it's not like China where they can just like build a 1,000-person capacity hospital in 10 days or whatever. Literally, if it's not profitable, they don't do it. And trying to mobilize resources under capitalism is sluggish at best. So you start getting all these people coming down with what we would understand as chronic conditions, even though they're caused by an infectious disease. Is the system going to be able to actually serve people? I mean, it's not really serving people well now. This combination of rising disease levels and scarce resources is, and again, there's that, scarcity again. Capitalism thrives on scarcity, which they have to maintain artificially. They're doing that in this case as well. It's forcing medical professionals to reevaluate the way they practice medicine and organize healthcare, putting a greater emphasis on preventative care, collaborative working, and telehealth to manage chronic disease and boost population health. Now, I believe in all those things, but again, capitalism, for profit, there are real material constraints being put on what can actually be done. Because, bottom line, they need people to be sick. That's how they make their money. And, what passes for preventative care, honestly, is a joke in the United States. It's a fucking joke. It's a disgrace as well. Given the many challenges healthcare professionals are facing, quote, it's impossible to square the circle unless we are prepared to very fundamentally rethink how we deliver healthcare, says Jeremy Lim, director of the Leadership Institute for Global Health Transformation at Singapore's NUS Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health. Let me add something there that just reminded me of when I said that what passes for preventative care, etc., that sort of like wraparound care, integrative care. When we were talking about this sort of health supremacists, where it's like, oh, I don't need medicine because I do all this like natural stuff and I exercise and whatever. You should do both though, actually. Like that's kind of what's happened is it's been polarized out really wrongly into the medical system puts virtually no emphasis on like, you know, coaching people in a realistic way about diet, except for, you know, very few people get that kind of care, or, you know, supplements, exercise, sleep, like really working with people in that, with really working with people in a serious way along those things, treating some of those things as medicine because they can actually dramatically reduce your risk in some cases of getting certain diseases, et cetera, or whether it's talking about stress and you know, things related to the way that people work. And, you know, again, we don't have control over production or conditions people work in, and other limitations structurally that we come up against with capitalism. But so there tends to be very little, you get very paltry emphasis on preventative care if you get any information at all. Meanwhile, then you get people who like completely eschew the medical system and then, you know, become kind of like warriors for like natural stuff. And then they don't get some of the standard medical treatment that they should be getting. So this is one of the outcomes that has emerged from this state of affairs is people wind up only doing half of what they should be doing. Whether it's they only do the sort of preventative wellness stuff. And then, you know, they wind up with there's some very good preventative wellness stuff. And then there's some very non-evidence-based, wacky, flaky preventative care stuff that tends to be, you know, like, you know, the sort of Alex Jones brain pills. Not everything is quite that bad, but that's sort of an extreme example of it. So, you know, there needs to be a reconciliation of these things. And it seems like the current system is just going further and further away from that direction. Anyway, you know, and the outcome is people end up suffering. The average person ends up suffering. Continuing, you have to think of the whole patient. Okay, nice that you're finally coming around to holistic care concepts. All it took was a pandemic, and even then it won't be implemented properly. Many of these changes were under consideration before the pandemic struck, especially in countries with aging populations. Yeah, under consideration being the key there. You know, it was really in the we'll think about it category. But the crisis has accelerated their implementation while also serving as a kind of large-scale demonstration project for the advantages of a different approach. One lesson the pandemic has taught, say experts, is the degree to which different conditions intersect and how that affects patients' potential to recover. Quote, I do think the connection between chronic disease risks like diabetes and obesity, and infectious disease outcomes, which people knew abstractly, has become so tangible during COVID that it is breaking down some of these barriers, says Murray. For infectious disease specialists like himself, he says, the past 2 years had led to a growing awareness that, quote, you have to think of the whole patient. You can't think of managing pandemics or infectious threats as distinct from good management of primary care and general health of the community and patients, unquote. So, okay, that's good. I mean, I'm obviously mocking the lag here. It's good that they're coming around to that. We need to be there to guide that thinking and provide leadership, because eventually what people will realize, like this guy, is like, oh, we should, you know, actually have a healthier society in many ways. And actually effective healthcare would intersect with people's lives, you know, like 24/7. I don't mean that in like a big brother sense, but I mean what you do 24/7 affects your health. And it's important for medicine to like be addressing that, not just like, did you take the right pill? So, I mean, although of course taking the right pill sometimes can be very important. But you know, you can try to adopt that approach, but like I said, you're eventually going to run up against the systemic limitations of capitalism, science, and especially the implementation of public health, population health measures is very constrained by capitalism. And so we need to guide and agitate in that direction. And, you know, if we hear people starting to get it, help them take the next steps as far as, yes, you're right. However, the reason we don't have more of that now and the struggle you're going to have if you push for more of that in the near future is capitalism. If we don't get rid of that, you're going to have very limited results. You're going to make very limited progress if you're not making this also a struggle against capital, which is what's holding us back in the first place. We're no longer dealing with natural scarcity. We're no longer dealing with massive technology limitations. We are dealing with economic constraints that are propped up artificial scarcity and other profit-seeking measures. That's what's keeping it back. The effect of that may be greatest in middle-income countries, he argues, where, quote, a lot of health policies are still focused on maternal and child health and infectious disease. And now the connection to diabetes, heart disease, and chronic conditions is so obvious that we will see more health system interest and attention on tackling those issues, he says. Even in the rich world, however, COVID has created a new understanding of the different elements that contribute to keeping people healthy. I'll also say I think that this is somewhat overstating that. I haven't seen like some new like flood of revelation about that. That is the narrative they're going with, and clearly there's at least one anecdotal example of a doctor realizing that. But maybe not. It'd be nice if it did, but I'm not so sure. Anyway, this spans not simply medicine in its conventional sense, but nutrition and decent housing, for example. Wait a minute. Are you telling me that somebody living in a nice, like, environmentally friendly, newly constructed house that isn't full of pollutants is going to have a less health burden for somebody, than living in an old, diseased building full of mold and rodents, or somebody living in a tent, for example? You're kidding. You're kidding. Who knew? I'm glad COVID came along to make me realize that. Wow. Dr. Katrina Armstrong, who heads Columbia University's Irving Medical Center, says over the last 20 years of her career, quote, one of the challenges in medicine has been this division between people who say we're public health people and then people who say we're health care. I think the revolution that is happening, and I'd love it if it were, I'm a little less convinced, is that we are truly bringing those pieces together, unquote. After more than 2 years in which doctors and nurses had witnessed the reality of their patients' home lives through a telemedicine screen, quote, we're starting to see so many people be able to really understand the context around their patients and really engage with every part of the healthcare team, she says. So in other words, telemedicine, like meeting with a client through Zoom or a secure portal, showed them that poor people live in bad conditions. Wow, poor people exist. Who knew? Who knew? Thanks, COVID. Here's a chart, an infographic. Having had COVID-19 increases the risk for stroke and heart failure a year after the infection. Again, go back to our last COVID update about reinfection with BA5. We covered this as well, and not just the cardiovascular stuff. But anyway, let's look at it. Excess disease burden. So this is specifically excess disease burden within 12 months in those affected by acute cases of COVID-19 per 100,000 people. And again, remember, there's going to be a lot of people who had acute cases of COVID-19 but didn't know it because it was asymptomatic. I mean, it's just that's sort of just odd framing there in general. But yeah, I guess this is specifically people who knew it. All right, cerebrovascular disorders, you see stroke and TIA, and dysrhythmia, that is changes in the heartbeat, specifically like an incorrect heartbeat. Atrial fibrillation, sinus tachycardia, ventricular arrhythmias, I'm getting tired, atrial flutter, inflammatory heart disease such as pericarditis and myocarditis, ischemic heart disease, other cardiac disorders, thrombotic disorders, that's clotting. We covered that many times, pulmonary embolism, deep vein thrombosis, and supraficial vein thrombosis. A thrombus is a clot, and embolism is a clot that develops in your bloodstream and then it dislodges from wherever it formed and then can lodge in and where it really shouldn't, and block off your major blood supply and even kill you. So yeah, you can see that these are increased risk, stroke, heart failure, and a variety of other things. So moving on to the next. Armstrong believes that part of the solution to keeping people fitter lies in bringing healthcare closer to where they live, using telehealth, nursing programs, and community health workers to reach patients in their homes. Columbia is also rethinking how to educate the next generation of doctors. Oh boy. Medical students now spend more time outside the hospital, undertaking stints in the community. Team approach is encouraged. Again, just the lag on this is insane. They're like just discovering that poor people live in bad conditions. Like that's just rupturing their like sheltered consciousness now. My God. But it's like, you know, those of you who have worked 50 hours a week or whatever, how fucking exhausted are you, you know, after that? What do you think that's doing to your health? Is that going to be addressed in any meaningful way by this without it also being a struggle against capital? So again, you know, expect a sort of like lib wave when the doctors get involved here. It's going to be a question of how many of these people, well, we're going to have to be ready for that with a wave of anti-capitalist, not purely lib public health messaging. And that's just the bottom line, because these people are going to come in. We have to create an environment such that our influence is strong enough, they have to go with our flow. And of course, you know, they have all the privilege and they're used to thinking themselves as the smartest and most important people in the room. The God complex can be very real with MDs in particular. But we're going to have to break these people down psychologically, really, because just enough. Anyway, a team approach is encouraged in order to break down the barriers between different specialisms and categories of staff. Yeah, the egoism. Oh. Similar lessons have been absorbed in Europe, building on the ethos established during the pandemic when normally rigid lines between different specialisms blurred amid the demands of COVID. Björn Zuega, chief executive of Sweden's Karolinska University Hospital, one of the continent's biggest teaching hospitals, says that in a highly specialized situation such as his, you have a lot of silos because people know a lot about one thing. So silos here meaning people are broken off into compartmentalized specialties. However, that don't necessarily talk to each other. However, at the height of the pandemic, quote, in the intensive care unit, we had plastic surgeons staying in the dispensary, taking out the meds for the nurses because they could not operate. Everybody helped out and had a role. That made people more understanding of what their colleagues do. See how long before the egoism kicks back in and they forget all about that. Hopefully not, but I'm a bit cynical about that. One of the things that we want to keep working on now, post-COVID, is that collaboration, that teamwork. Again, more power to them. I don't mean to be overly cynical, but I'd like to be realistically aware of what we're actually up against there. And yeah, that'd be great. And you can see that sort of, you know, revolutionary emergency sort of forcing people to work together who normally, you know, not my job, whatever, from a very, very privileged place. Okay, that got broken down temporarily. People had to step outside their comfort zone. I think a lot of those people are going to be very likely to want to get back to their comfort zone as rapidly as possible. But, you know, this is like, you know, after a socialist revolution, these are the kinds of changes you make so that people don't stay in their privileged silos. You restructure things so that people do have to work together and they just have to suck it up and, you know, get over that ego and that sense of professional privilege, etc. Educating and empowering. As they cope with rising demand, many health systems will have little choice but to use existing staff more flexibly. Even before the pandemic, experts calculated that the world was 6.4 million doctors and almost 31 million nurses short of the numbers needed to provide safe and high-quality care. That's very true. In the case of something like a doctor, there are a number of reasons for that. Med school can be very expensive, but also keeping the supply of doctors down means you can keep the fees very high. Doctors make an extraordinarily comfortable living in the United States, pre-pandemic at least. This was a number of years ago. The average pay was $200,000 or $400,000 if you were a specialist. So yeah. In this context, ensuring resources meet demand may entail a more organized system of risk stratification, with patients' individual vulnerabilities calculated before decisions are taken, not only about their treatment, but the level of healthcare professional who should provide it. Dr. Javier Cos Claramunt, a Barcelona-based general practitioner and diabetes researcher who chairs Primary Care Diabetes Europe, believes that resources are no longer sufficient to give every patient the same level of follow-up. Far more precise assessments of individual risk will be required, perhaps involving the use of artificial intelligence to interrogate big data sets. There is this sort of emphasis on like AI and big data in medicine. That is not, though, a technological, like, it's not like that can't be done now. That would just maybe be an easier way of doing it. But what they're talking about here, like a lot of this stuff just isn't implemented at all, And there's very little push for it to be. And you could easily have people doing that. Like you don't need that. You don't need to wait for the robots, in other words. But it's not being done. And we've discussed a few of the what's propping up this current dysfunctional system. But yeah, it could be done now. So anyway, in some instances, this could mean patients working with coaches rather than clinical staff to look after their health, perhaps with the support of wearables type technology. The most highly qualified staff would then have more time to care for the patients whose conditions really warranted it. So in other words, not having people with like multiple doctorates, like just telling you to like get more fiber. But that can be done by somebody with far less training. And yeah, that makes sense. But as far as integrating the system, still many steps left to go. Patients would in turn need to be educated away from reliance on a, quote, paternalistic model and help to understand that they need to take responsibility for their own health, he argues. But healthcare professionals, policymakers, patients, and citizens would all have to align around the new approach if it was not simply to create fear and resistance, he warns. So this kind of went off the track a little bit. I think we were discussing some of the positive things. They're immediately jumping before they even get to how this would be implemented to what will go wrong. And, as far as this reliance on a paternalistic model, they're talking about people who just want a doctor to like literally give them orders and understand they need to take responsibility for their own health. Well, people actually do constantly get that messaging now. What they don't really get is the support to actually do it. Whether it's being paid enough that you can actually afford fruits and vegetables or like whatever it is. So, this is already skipping over a lot of the crucial elements. Some patients may struggle with this notion of empowerment. We're finding people to blame for when this doesn't work because of the constraints of capital. We're finding people to blame already. Some patients may struggle with this notion of empowerment. At Columbia, Armstrong says that the pandemic taught her how many patients without health insurance relied on informal networks of support, whether from nurses at urgent care centers, pharmacists, or family members. The pandemic had frayed these support structures, revealing a big gap in patients' knowledge about how to care for themselves. Quote, when people came in, we kind of talked at them, sent them at home, and assumed it was all going to be okay, but you have to have really basic health literacy to survive in this new world order. Well, you always did, and so you're saying yourself, you're aware that you kind of talked at people. When did you think that that was a good approach? Is it just COVID that made you think it wasn't a good one? Because newsflash, it was never a good approach. In Singapore, Jeremy Lim acknowledges that structures must be kept in place for those who, perhaps for reasons of disability or discomfort with technology, are not able to take their health destinies into their own hands. Yet even if only 50% of patients were able to take charge in this way, quote, that means that there's 50% of the resources freed up to care for those patients who otherwise would have gotten 5 minutes with a doctor when they should have gotten 35. As an example, Lim pointed to patients who would previously have visited their family physician 4 times a year for blood pressure checks, but could now take their own measurements automatically via their phones, with the result uploaded to a system that a doctor or nurse could track remotely. An algorithm would flag up outliers. So again, sort of emphasis on technology, which I don't think is really the problem. Although even with this system, yes, it could improve the kind of care and, quote, freeing up resources. Although again, under capitalism, this is basically pursued in the sort of, chasing increased profits, improving efficiency in that sense, type of point of view. I want to also add, I mentioned people getting paid enough to afford fresh fruits and vegetables. Let's also throw in, I've mentioned that I've been sort of planning or making notes for a Cooking with S4A series. I had somebody in the comments talking about, do people really not know how to cook for themselves? And they were giving me kind of an attitude about it. I was like, yes, yes, okay. Yes, accept it. A lot of people don't know really how to cook well, or they know how to make pasta and like that's it. So even if people get healthier foods, they don't necessarily know what to do with them. And, just so people wind up eating packaged stuff, which isn't as fresh, isn't as healthy, doesn't have as, many beneficial like plant chemicals in it. Will have preservatives and stuff, which, okay, gave it shelf life. And yeah, you're getting those macronutrients, the calories, good, you need those, but it's maybe not as healthy as like a fresher meal. And not to fault people, a lot of people didn't grow up learning how to cook or eating freshly prepared meals. And yeah, people do need to be taught how to cook. It's just the person had like such a problem with this. So there's add another barrier that needs to be torn down to the list. All right, we're getting near the end here. This is the third to last screen. Then I'm probably going to wrap it up. For today, I'll save the comments and we'll come back probably in a second stream this week to address some more stuff. All right. One of the big discoveries of the pandemic was that technology and self-testing are key to enabling health systems to cope with a workforce that does not rise in line with demand, he says. Quote, we in healthcare have always felt that we were unique, that healthcare is very, very bespoke, and that the more patients you had, the more healthcare professionals you needed. That calculus had shifted during the COVID crisis, moving the sector closer to the model of financial services, in which physical visits to a bank are reserved for complex transactions, such as mortgages, where more quotidian needs, or let's say daily, because why, met online. Regular day-to-day needs met online. Quote, I think over the last 2.5 years, we have learned which types of health conditions are amenable to telemedicine, and which types of diseases patients can actually self-help. In other words, there are things which are served well over a FaceTime type call. There are other things that aren't. And so it's like, what do people really need to come into the office for? And, what can somebody really be helped with over a video call? Far from being a solution that was only practicable in wealthier countries, quote, I would argue it needs to happen in the developing world even more because resources are even more constrained. The rich world has the luxury of being inefficient to some extent, but the developing world has no choice but to be clever. Now, I'm not sure exactly what countries they're talking about there, but I will say that, as they sort of alluded to earlier in the article, the problem in less developed countries, underdeveloped countries, which in many cases are deliberately undeveloped countries due to imperialism and colonialism, infectious disease tends to be much more of a problem than what we call chronic disease, which is more things caused by like diet and lifestyle. In the more underdeveloped countries, infectious diseases, which may have been eradicated due to more things like refrigeration and vaccines and things like that, or just simple treatments, may not be available, so people still succumb to the infection. However, they may have fewer of the chronic diseases, which are sometimes called things like diseases of affluence, like type 2 diabetes, because people might eat a more traditional diet, which is not going to trigger some of the health problems like heart disease or blood sugar imbalance or whatever, or they'd be less likely to do that. Some of it's genetic, but some of it is caused by what you put in your body for food every day too, or exacerbated by it anyway. And even in the realm of genetics, there's also epigenetics, which is things around your genes which respond to environmental prompts and turn genes on and off. So, it's still working with the raw material in your DNA, but it's flipping switches on which parts of it get used and which don't. Anyway, that's kind of just one of the things between different levels of development. So I don't know, about the telehealth. It's like, I guess I'd have to see what conditions they're talking about, but a long-term challenge even as health systems around the world adjust to what many fear will be an era of structurally higher demand for healthcare. Right, because remember, we're talking about long COVID, giving people heart disease and all kinds of other organ weaknesses, right? Researchers and clinicians remain divided on how irrevocably the landscape of illness has been reshaped by COVID. The IFMI's Murray believes that more data is needed to draw firm conclusions. Quote, what will the future trajectory for people's health be once we come out of COVID? Will it look very different? That's the question. Well, let's come out of COVID first. At this point, there's no real sign of coming out of COVID, so we'll see. That's the question, and that's the part that I think still remains to be proven, Murray says. This may be a 3-year shock to health, and not just a shock that will last many, many years. We will see. Gwenaël Daoud, associate professor at Oxford University's Nuffield Department of Clinical Neurosciences, who led the study on brain shrinkage that shocked strain, agrees that it is too soon to make predictions about future burdens. Last screen. Some of these impairments, cerebral and cognitive, may partially normalize in time. Ultimately, this is something only extensive follow-up studies will be able to tell us. And count me on the less optimistic side of that. I think that the data so far suggests fairly long-reaching effects, especially if COVID keeps going and people keep getting reinfected, because the data we have now are based on 1 infection, 2 infections, maybe 3 infections. When you start getting up to people have had their 5th, 6th, and 7th reinfection, it might change the game. We don't know what happens at that stage yet on a population level. But as he prepares to publish further findings from his scrutiny of the VA database, Ali is in no doubt that clinicians and society at large will be dealing with the after effects of COVID in perpetuity. That would be more the camp I would be in. Well, this is not something that will go away in a week, in a year, or 2, or 3. This will reverberate with us for generations, he says. In Singapore, Lim is striving to see opportunity amid the challenges. Healthcare, quote, is now front and center of many governments and many global agencies' agendas. Is it though? So hopefully there is much more prioritization. There's much more investments into healthcare. But the world's health needs have grown in the aftermath of the pandemic, he warns. Quote, and if our tools to address healthcare demand don't change, if our models of care don't change, then let's just say we're in for a very, very bumpy ride. Unquote, end of article. I would agree. So I'm definitely over what I usually do for a stream. I have not even checked in with the chat. Hopefully all hell is not breaking loose in there. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to grab the chat and save it and then pick up in the next stream, which will be possibly tomorrow or as soon as I can manage. I'll post it on the YouTube community post, on Twitter, and on Patreon, as I usually do with stream announcements. So keep your eye out there. We'll pick up with the stream there because I really can't go any further today. But hopefully this has been informative for you, and we'll continue the conversation next time. Thanks again, and we'll see you then.